request before we get started. Please silence your cell phones and please no food or beverages in the spectator area. It is now my pleasure to introduce Eric Paulsen. Eric is an award-winning journalist who has spent the last 30 years at WWL-TV in New Orleans on the highly rated morning and noon news programs. Paulsen conducted the last television interview with Tennessee Williams, has covered music and business news, and extensively reported on the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, staying on the air for 13 hours straight during the storm's landfall. He is also a published photographer.
Thank you very much. And, thanks, Roy. Do you mind if I sit? It's like a Senate hearing. The reason we're here today, we have a couple of great authors. We have several great authors up here. But we're talking about what's being called America's Third Coast series. Most people are familiar with the East Coast, the West Coast. Sometimes the best coast is the forgotten coast. And that's what the Third Coast series is all about. Louisiana's Third Coast. All the way from Key West, Florida to Brownsville, Texas. It's a huge coastline, and as I said, sometimes the forgotten coastline. We have a great panel up here this morning, this afternoon rather. Wendy Rodrigue, you can see some of her late husband's paintings here. She'll be speaking later after this forum on her book called The Other Side of the Painting. And if you have time to stick around for that, it's going to be a wonderful talk. Clifton Theriot, archivist at Nicholls State University, has published a pictorial book on the Fouche Parish. And Carl Brasseaux, to my left, from Lafayette, the former director of the Center for Louisiana Studies and author of more than 36 books. And he is one of the founders of the America's Third Coast series. So Carl, if you want to tell everybody a bit about it.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? Yes. Okay. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate Dr. Cenac and Bernard on their publications, their fine publications. They constitute the inaugural volumes in the Third Coast series, which is being published by the University Press of Mississippi, thanks in part to a subsidy from the Louisiana Sea Grant Office. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Sea Grant, it's basically a state-federal partnership that is the counterpart for maritime industries, the counterpart of the Ag Extension Service in Louisiana. Every state with an extensive coastline and maritime commercial fishery has one. The series is intended as a multi-tiered series. It's going to include books, monographs, pamphlets, all geared to a general readership. It's intended to cover a full spectrum of topics, again, covering the entire geographic arc of the Gulf of Mexico. The series initially is Louisiana-centric, but it will morph very quickly into a regional series focusing on the entire Gulf Coast. That's reflected in the pending manuscripts. 2 volumes will be released this year, the one by Chris Cenac, the other by Shane Bernard. 4 volumes are projected for next year, and they include Ain't There No More, which is a book by Don Davis and myself. Don Davis is the other co-editor of the series. And that one deals primarily with the way that we got into this mess in terms of coastal erosion. Swamp Rat, a history of the nutria industry on the Gulf Coast. Fragile Grounds, which deals with the disappearance of cultural resources in the rapidly disappearing coastal wetlands. And then we have a monograph on the 1973 flood in which the course of the Mississippi very nearly turned to the Atchafalaya Basin. We are also in the process of reviewing manuscripts dealing with coastal issues in Texas, Alabama, and Mississippi. Why a Third Coast series? Well, as you indicated so eloquently, it's usually the forgotten coast. When people talk about the great cities of the United States, for example, they talk about New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, but they never mention Houston, the 4th largest city in this country, in the same breath. It's the hope of this series that because it's going to be geared to a general readership, that it will provide authoritative information to Louisianians, or in fact residents of the entire Gulf Coast, and will provide an authoritative and readily digestible source of information as people are called upon to make educated decisions as we face environmental challenges of biblical proportion. So you didn't come here to hear me rattle on about the series, but I wanted all of you to know about it, and I want to congratulate once again the authors of our initial 2 volumes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. And one of our featured speakers is Dr. Chris Cenac. He's a renowned orthopedic surgeon and the unofficial historian of Terrebonne Parish. He may think he's the official. His 3rd book, Hard Scrabble to Hallelujah, Legacies of Terrebonne Parish, is the first in a 4-volume series which he'll be talking about today. Our other speaker is Shane Bernard, a renowned author from New Iberia. He's penned several books on life in South Louisiana. His latest work is called Teche, A History of Louisiana's Most Famous Bayou. Now, Clifton will probably say that Bayou Lafourche is Louisiana's most famous bayou. Chris, on the other hand, will probably say Bayou Terrebonne is Louisiana's most famous bayou. But
No question.
Shane, go ahead and make the case for Teche being Louisiana's most famous bayou.
Well, here's the book right here. Is this on, by the way?
Apparently not.
All right. Well, sorry. So, I've spent the last 7 years researching and writing this book. And, I live about 2 blocks away from Bayou Teche. And I got the idea after reading Life on the Mississippi by Mark Twain. I did that around 2008 or 2009, and it occurred to me that I had a miniature Mississippi River only a few steps from my house, because a lot of what Mark Twain wrote about, I knew enough about the Teche to know that much of what he talked about in regard to the Mississippi also happened on the Teche. So I began to wonder, could I write an entire narrative history about Bayou Teche? What about the colonial era? Were there enough documents from that time period for me to form a coherent story? So I began to look into the matter, and I realized, yes, there is enough material, even from the early colonial period of Louisiana history. And so I began to work on the project. And so it begins with the geologic formation of the Teche. First you had the Mississippi River running right through south central Louisiana before it shifted to the east. Then the Red River took its place and it shifted its course, and what was left finally was what we call Bayou Teche. And that's why the Teche has 3 different natural levees that make up its ridge, because you had 3 different rivers running through the area over several thousand years. But it was about 2,000 years ago that the Teche itself was left in place. By that time, there had already been Native Americans in the area. There's some evidence that there were Native Americans in that area as long ago as 13,000 years ago, the last ice age. There is a 4,500-year-old Indian mound on Avery Island where I work, and that's as old as the pyramids in Egypt. You have about 75 Indian mounds in the 4 parishes through which the Teche runs. That's St. Landry, St. Mary, St. Martin, and Iberia parishes. And a lot of those mounds are directly on the bayou. In fact, as you go down the bayou by boat, you can see some of them slowly eroding into the bayou. So I discussed that prehistoric Native American history, and then I deal with the Attakapaw, the Chitimacha, the Opelousas. Finally, you get to the first European and the first African slaves arriving around 1746 with a really fascinating man named Andre Massa, who was sort of a Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett of the time. He was a Frenchman who had come from Grenoble and had decided to put civilization behind him. So he went out into the Attakapaw region of south central Louisiana, which is roughly where around Lafayette and New Iberia are located. And he went out there with his slaves. There were no other Europeans in that area at the time, partly because of the belief that the Attakapaw Indians in that area were cannibalistic. Whether they were or not really doesn't matter, because enough people believed it to keep them out of that area. And you had the Spanish in Mexico who viewed the province of Texas, their Mexican province of Texas, running all to the west bank of the Mississippi River. You had the French in New Orleans claiming the same land as their own. So New Iberia, Lafayette, Abbeville, all that area was in this disputed zone at the time that neither side really had a hold on. And so when the Spanish realized that this Frenchman had moved into the Teche area, they kept a close eye on him, but that's all they could do. And they wrote to each other about him, that what is what is this Frenchman doing? That's our land. They say he's a cattleman, but we think he's actually a contraband runner. They say he's intermarried with the Indians there. How could he do that? They're heathens. And he develops this larger-than-life persona, so that eventually the Spanish are convinced that he has absolute dominion, which is an exact quote from these Spanish documents from the 1750s, over the local Indian tribes, and as far north as several Plains Indian tribes, which is possible, but I doubt it. But I think they were exaggerating. And in his wake came other French settlers, Ledy, Fuselier de la Claire, Sorel, among others, and they settled on the Teche, and they weren't growing cotton or sugar yet. They were cattle ranching, but eventually they decided to experiment with indigo. So they began to grow indigo there and convert it into little chunks of dye that they would send by barrel back to Europe so that people could dye clothing in it. Turned out that the indigo grown along the Teche was a bit inferior to that grown in Central America and the Caribbean, and plus there were a lot of pests that ate those plants, so they gave that up and they started growing cotton. Well, that grew really well in the upper Teche, as it would for generations, but on the lower Teche, not so much. Finally, they figured out that sugar grew very well down there, and the sugar industry exploded, but it really took off around 1830, because that's when you had the convergence of steam power, not just in steamboats, but in steam sugar houses. So instead of animal power crushing the cane, you had the steam engines crushing the cane. Then after it was converted to sugar or molasses or sometimes rum, you put it on a steamboat instead of a flatboat, which was powered by oar, because you can't use sails on the Teche. These steamboats would take the cotton and sugar to New Orleans through the Atchafalaya Basin. It took 5 days to do that. And it was around 1830 that happened, and that caused the production of sugar to really explode along the Teche. That meant there was a need for more labor, so you began to have, for the first time, large-scale slaveholding along the Teche. There was slaveholding along the Teche going back to Andre Massa in the 1740s, but large-scale slaveholding took off at that time. And also the area became very wealthy for the first time, and that's when these big plantation homes, some of which are still there, they weren't all burned down during the Civil War or neglected afterwards, that's when they were built. And because the region was so wealthy, that attracted the attention of the Union military during the Civil War. They invaded the Bayou Teche 3 times between 1863 and 64, partly because it was so wealthy, partly because they couldn't hold it the first 2 times. And during that time, a lot of the homes along the Teche were burned and ransacked and that sort of thing. There were 2 major Civil War battles that took place along the Teche: the Battle of Irish Bend and the Battle of Fort Bislin. you had at most maybe about 18,000 men involved, so it wasn't Gettysburg or anything like that, but these were real battles. And they were important because the Teche was viewed as having a bearing on the Mississippi River, which was extremely valuable. So it was sort of a side avenue to attacking the Mississippi River. And when the war ended with the South's defeat, a lot of the residents along the Teche tried to pick up the pieces and begin growing cotton and sugar again. But the price for both those commodities plummeted dramatically after the war, partly because places like Cuba and the Philippines and eventually Hawaii were growing a lot of sugar. And a lot of these old planting families along the Teche went bankrupt and lost their big, the big houses along the Teche that they had built. You had a lot of northern corporations coming in, buying up those old sugar plantations and running them like northern businesses, and they didn't have any interest in the old plantation homes. They just let them fall apart. But they enforced new ways of business, modern business techniques on these old plantations because all they really wanted to do was to make money. And but the price was so bad with sugar along the Teche that the planters there had to find something else to do, so they switched to rice. And this was something, well, almost entirely new. People had grown rice on a small scale along the Teche, but now to grow it as a major cash crop, they had to invest in building levees around their property. They had to buy steam pumps to pump water from the Teche onto their property in between those levees, because you have to have a flooded area to grow the rice. And that's why you have, if you've ever been to New Iberia, there's Conrad Rice Mill there. That's why Conrad Rice Mill is there, is because by around 1910 or 1920, you had more people on the lower Teche raising rice than sugar cane. And this all changed eventually when the price of sugar went back up, partly because of government subsidies and that sort of thing, and tariffs. But the Conrad Rice Mill is still working in New Iberia today, even though the state's rice industry is over in Acadia Parish and in that area today. After the Civil War, you had not only this economic upheaval, and a lot of people reduced to poverty, even people who had formerly been wealthy, but you had disease. You had cholera, and especially yellow fever. And yellow fever had been a big problem before the war. Surprisingly, it didn't show up during the war, during all that destruction, but it came back with a vengeance after the Civil War. And several times it would show up. You know, another name for yellow fever back then was black vomit, so it's not a pretty disease. And we know now it was carried by mosquito, and often the outbreaks would start in New Orleans and then spread from elsewhere. The theory is that ships were bringing infected mosquitoes and people to New Orleans from tropical ports, and then the disease would spread by steamboat up the bayous, and so it would periodically show up. And the mortality rate seemed to be generally about 10% per each community, but sometimes half the community would be wiped out. It depends on how advanced their medical care was, how hygienic the place was that the people were being treated. But it was a very terrible disease, and it wasn't until around 1898 to 1905 that scientists realized, oh, it's mosquitoes that are spreading this, so if we get rid of the mosquitoes and the places they breed, we can better control this. And finally, 1905 was the last major outbreak of yellow fever, and it happened along the Teche. At the same time, after the Civil War, you have the decline of the steamboat. You had these big, beautiful steamboats. The same steamboats that were going up and down the Mississippi would end up on Bayou Teche, and these things were so long, they could not turn around unless they got to a turning basin dug into the bank. And they would bring goods to the planters and the other people living on the Teche. They'd bring goods from New Orleans, then return to New Orleans with the cotton and the molasses and the sugar and the rum. But you can actually track after the Civil War, as I do, the decline of the steamboat industry, with fewer and fewer steamboats arriving in New Orleans from the Teche region. And eventually a lot of these steamboats end up pushing showboats up the Teche and bringing people down the Teche to the beach along Vermilion Bay for picnics and things like that. They were sort of relegated to doing that. And finally they ended up pulling long rafts of logs for the logging industry, which erupted on a large scale around 1880, to all the lumber mills along the Teche. There are many lumber mills, but because there was no effort at conservation, these lumber mills ran themselves out of business. They cut down all the trees, there were none left, they went out of business, and the last of the steamboats went with them. And the rest of the history of the Teche from, say, around 1940 on is really the story of the decline of the Teche as a means of everyday transportation. It did pick up, though, when people invented the new push boat. A lot of people call these tugboats. They're actually push boats. The push boat and barge method of transportation. You know, one of these barges alone, you could fit an entire steamboat on it. And so it takes many less boats now to move. They can move much more than the steamboats ever did. So it kind of looks like the Teche is dead today, but actually it's moving more tonnage of oil-related equipment, oyster shells, gravel, limestone than ever before. And I end the book by looking at how the Teche is slowly bouncing back thanks to the efforts of groups like the Teche Project, the Tour de Teche adventure race, which also cleans up the Teche, Cajuns for the Teche, which is another group that cleans up. And every year they remove tons of garbage from the bayou. But you know, the bayou is still, it's considered by the EPA, almost the entire length of the bayou is considered a dangerous waterway for swimming. It's called, quote, an impaired waterway for swimming, even for boating, much less for fishing. There was a fish sample found in the Teche around 2000 that contained 75% more DDT in it than is considered the safe threshold, and that's considering the fact that DDT was outlawed in the 1970s. It's still there. In the early 1900s, the federal government sprayed arsenic in the Teche to kill the water lilies. Well, arsenic is an element like hydrogen or helium. It doesn't break down into simpler stuff. That arsenic is still there in measurable quantities. So there's still a lot of work to do to make the Teche cleaner than it was. And the last part of the book is about my personal canoe journey down the Teche, all 125 miles of it. What I saw, I took lots of photographs, lots of GPS coordinates, and lots of notes about what you can see as you canoe down the Teche. So, thank you very much.
And now Chris Cenac will talk about his book called Hard Scrabble to Hallelujah, Legacies of Terrebonne Parish, and I assume give his take on why Bayou Terrebonne may be the most famous bayou in Louisiana.
Well, since y'all been hearing about what's west of the Atchafalaya from these two guys, you're going to hear a little bit about what's east of the Atchafalaya. And to remind Dr. Bernard, William Bislin owned Hope Farm in Aragon, in Terrebonne Parish, and he owned Fairfax, where the Battle of Bislin was in St. Mary's Parish, and his son owned that plantation. So he had to come to Terrebonne before he got over there. On top of that, well, the Mississippi River shifted, and when it got tired of the west side of the Atchafalaya, it moved to the east and created Lafourche, Bayou Lafourche, and subsequently Bayou Terrebonne, seeking higher and better ground. You got nothing on us. Oh, Lord. But anyway, I'm here because of these two guys and another guy, Dr. Davis, and this guy too, and this lady too. They got me started into doing this. I'm not a writer, I'm an orthopedic surgeon, but anyway. It's a learning experience for me as it is from everybody sitting out here listening to people speaking about this recorded history. Is wonderful. how do I change the page? Ma'am, how do I change that?
You have to use the laptop.
Have to? Okay, fine. Would you push the next one, please? Okay. Well, first of all, Horse Scrabble to Hallelujah. This 4-volume series is, we've divided Terrebonne Parish up geographically with the Venice of America. And everybody, I mean, the people settled in the wilderness area. Terrebonne Parish was named and became a parish in 1822 when we were separated from the Lafourche interior. We were the lower Lafourche, the wilderness area, which was the backbone of Terrebonne Parish, is Bayou Terrebonne. And the seafood industry and the subsequent agriculture industries developed from below the coast, because it was easy to live on the coast. All the food was there, et cetera, et cetera. And they used the waterways to get to Houma, which is in the northern part of the parish. And Bayou Terrebonne actually originates. Go to the next one, please. Next one. Oh, my buddy. Back. This book is dedicated to my friend, George, who urged me to do this, actually. And we had a lot in common. He was from a small town around St. Martinville, per se. And we became friends, and the first book I wrote, I sent it to him, and we were having dinner the next few days, and he says, "God damn, Chris, that's a real book." So from that, it is where we are today. And I owe a lot to him for urging me to do this, and his beautiful wife, Wendy. And I just felt that this is something I had to do to dedicate this series to him. Next, please. That's Bayou Terrebonne, I mean, that's Terrebonne Parish. And if you notice all the way at the top, you'll see it goes all the way to, you can't see it, it's all the way at the top to the point, goes right to Lafourche Parish, almost downtown Thibodeauville. And that's where the bayou comes off of Bayou Terrebonne. Bayou Terrebonne comes off of Bayou Lafourche, and it goes straight down the middle of the parish. The other bayous, starting on the east, Bayou Terrebonne is the longest, first settled, and then you have Bayou Little Cayenne and Bayou Grand Cayenne. Of course, there's Bayou Pointe-aux-Chenes and Bayou Blue. And there's Bayou du Large. In the old days, when the area was surveyed, after the United States became, for the Louisiana Purchase of the owner, the surveyors called this particular bayou Bayou Buffalo because of the large buffalo herds seen in the area. We now call it Bayou du Large. And then you have the Black. Bayou Black starts up at the northern part of the parish, off of Bayou Terrebonne, parallels it down, and it's the only bayou, it's very important, it's the only bayou that turns due west and heads to Morgan City or Brazier City at the time. And the key to this is, remember, everybody's living in New Orleans. This is what the population was, and everybody wanted to go west to see these guys. But they had to pass through Terrebonne first, and there were no roads. So in 1820, the New Orleans, the Lafourche Railroad, Lafourche Canal, Barataria Canal, number 1 and 2, formed, and it was a water route to get from New Orleans to Brazier City through Terrebonne Parish, and then from there, they get on the boat through the Morgan's Steamship Company and head west to Texas. The war came, and by the time the war came, we had the New Orleans, Opelousas, and Great Western Railroad from Algiers to Terrebonne Station, from Terrebonne Station to Brazier City. Again, to bring people 1855 to bring people west. That brought on and accelerated the end of the steamboat era, the beginning of the railroad era. It was terrible. And then came the war. In the war, the federal troops got on the railroad first, and they had the first big battle at Bayou Terrebonne, and the second one at the Fourche Crossing. And then they got to Morgan City, Brazos City, had a few there, and then they had, by the time the war was going bad for the Confederacies, they had a few in St. Mary Parish, including the Battle of Pisnum. What's interesting is that the word la guerre means the war. Guerrilla, the word guerrilla warfare, was invented in Terrebonne and Lower Lafourche parishes because after the Civil War was over with, not everybody down there knew the war was over. And they're the only ones that knew the waterways. And the Confederate forces in Terrebonne and Lafourche continued to fight the war. And they would sneak up the bayou, have a skirmish, and go back down. And the Union didn't know how to get them. And so there was the beginning of guerrilla warfare as a named entity. The railroad was demolished, and then Mr. Morgan took it over, and he developed the Texas Louisiana Railroad Steamship Company to Brazos City, and then subsequently to Lafayette. In 1878, they got to Lafayette, and then from Orange City, Texas, through Lake Charles, they met up in Lafayette, and that completed our expansion into the Teche. And it was the end of the steamship company. But anyway, it's a wonderful history, and I'm just going to tell you next, please. That's the beginning. That's Thibodeauville, 1850 or so, and that's the beginning of Bayou Terrebonne in downtown Canal Boulevard, Thibodeau. This particular book has 502 pages, 1,379 images, and 117,450 words. It begins with the story of the Homus house. The Homus originally migrated there after a few battles with the Tunica from Ascension Parish, and after some fights there, they came down by Lafourche and settled in basically Lower Terrebonne and somewhat in Lower Lafourche. And 1784 is when they left, and the first settlement in Terrebonne Parish was at Whiskey Point on present-day Bayou Black. When Terrebonne was admitted to the state, it was the largest state in the parish. I mean, the largest parish in the state. And as Dr. Brasseaux has mentioned, we're now second largest because we have the largest loss of land mass as a result of coastal erosion. So we went from first to second, and it's not stopping. In 1830, we had 237 households, half white, half slaves, and 25 free people of color. He mentioned the migration of settlers into that area. We had some too. Jim Bowie and his brother Resin were living in Alexandria, and they started buying land in Terrebonne and Lafourche Parish, lived there. Bowie Park is in downtown Homer, and subsequently moved to Acadia Plantation in Lafourche Parish, lived there before they subsequently settled more west in Opelousas. In 1851, we had 110 plantations, indigo, rice, wheat, corn, and sugar. 80 sugar houses. Now we have no sugar houses and no named sugar estates, just about 9 houses with a name. 59 Americans owned those plantations, and 20 Frenchmen and a few other Europeans. In 1860, the largest productive plantations were not on the high ground, considered high ground today. They were on the coast, at the end of Bayou Dulac, by Grand Caille, Dulac, Live Oak, and Dulac plantations. Terrebonne Parish is called Good Earth. In French, Bon Terre, Good Earth. That's probably a misnomer. The Terrebonne, D-E-E-R-E-B-O-N-N-E family came by sea and settled in Lower Terrebonne in the late 1700s. And the Ludlow map, 1516, and the other one, the Darby map, the next year, 1817. They have the main bayou in Terrebonne Parish called Bayou Terrebonne. I have no idea, and I don't know of anybody that's ever determined why they switched it or when. And it is now Terrebonne, but it started out as Terrebonne. It's 50 miles long. It's from Theriot to home is 17 miles. We have in Terrebonne Parish, as we have all over South Louisiana, all the different land measurement terms and types of surveys. The French brought the ARPANT system, the Spanish had the long lots, and the CTOs. The British had mets and bounds, which was a topographical type of survey system, meaning 400 chains from the big oak tree on Bayou Sally, turn west and go to the edge of Lake Michon, and then go north to the coast. But if the tree died or the rock moved or what have you, then that didn't work anymore. So after 1803, Thomas Jefferson, Louisiana Purchase, he brought in the township range and section model, which is 36 square miles to a township, 1 square mile sections. The present situation, starting in 1890 to about 1927, after the Mosaic disease, we had 37 named sugar estates, large houses, Greek Revival, Queen Anne, Eastlake, Colonial Revival, Victorian, Acadian. And we had a lot of non-grand houses like the Louisiana Raised Cottage, etc. The Mosaic disease devastated the sugarcane industry in 1916-17. The cure for the Mosaic disease was developed in Southdown Plantation in Homer, Louisiana. And it was because Mr. Elliott Jones, who was the surveyor, the overseer for Mr. Minor and the estate of Mr. Minor, he met Dr. Brandeis in Washington, D.C. and brought back some POJ cane. In Dutch, it's Profestation Oostjava in 1922. And by 1924, they had 4 acres of this new hybrid cane in Terrebonne Parish and replanted the entire coast of Louisiana and Texas and revived the entire sugarcane industry to this day. I'm smarter on this side too, We have 7 major distributaries of Bayou Terrebonne itself, Bayou Black, Bayou Cane, Grand Caille, Little Caille, Pointe-aux-Chenes, Jean Charles, and St. Charles. We had 2 syrup mills up until the 50s, and we have 16 communities just on Bayou Terrebonne. And I'm not going to name all that. The story also goes back, the book also goes back, and the Hache claim, Joseph Hache, he was a landowner before the Louisiana Purchase, and it was confirmed in 1820. And Brigitte Emily Belanger, was married to Henry Scarlett Thibodeau, the founder of Thibodeau, and the father of Terrebonne, and the only person from Terrebonne Parish to serve as governor of the state of Louisiana. And when he died, his wife did some swapping with her brother Francois, and then Hubert the son, et cetera, et cetera. And Houma was formed in they started the first city, they couldn't determine where they were going to put the capital, the parish seat, I should say. At first it was in Williamsburg up on Bayou Cane, and that didn't work out in 1822. So by 1834, they did the Hache grant and transferred the property, and the town of Houma grew up around that. And that was done on May the 10th, 1834. It was only 338 acres. And the cost of the 338 acres, which became the heart of Terrebonne Parish, was $150. It became incorporated in 1848. In 1850, when my great-grandfather got there, there were 15 buildings and 429 people living. This book brings and identifies the 9 different subdivisions that were built, which we grew up knowing as back of town. And those subdivisions began starting in 1870, and we stopped in 1940. And it tells the story of the courthouse and the jail. And we also had a little problem with the northern troops. They burned the courthouse down in 1862, among other things, and several plantation homes, Crescent, Mulberry, etc., because they ambushed the Union troops coming from the railroad in Shreva, marching through Houma, going to Honduras Plantation, heading to Live Oak to go to Fort Quitman, which was the Confederate fort at the bottom of the Gulf, bottom of the parish, guarding against Union invasion from the south. And they ambushed them and killed 2 troops, so they sent a whole bunch of more troops, and they burned downtown Houma, 1862. The second courthouse was completed in 1875, and at the request of the Terrebonne Parish Police Jury, my great-grandfather and 2 of his sons brought by wagon train, a mule train, 24 oak trees, which are the oak trees, and they were planted in 1877 in downtown Houma, and those are the oak trees, the Cenac oaks, that are in the court square today. Other subdivisions developed around Terrebonne and, Houma, Louisiana. Daggville is one. But we also had some other things that are unique in Terrebonne Parish. We had the United States Naval Air Station, LTA, lighter than air. When you go to an airport today, you land at an airport, it's an HTA, heavier than air. LTA was a blimp base, and the federal government had 13, we're going to build 17, they only built 13, from the East Coast, from New York City, down the East Coast, all across the Gulf Coast, to get to Texas and to protect the oil shipping. In 1942, the Nazi U-boats sank 90 ships off the coast of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. So the federal government spent $13 million and built the Naval Air Station Houma. And we were an anti-submarine base at the time. And beginning in 1942, after the battle of the Mediterranean, when the Allied forces defeated Rommel and the Germans in the Mediterranean, the Africa Corps, which was 450,000 German Africa Corpsmen, were brought to the United States because there was no more room for them in England or Europe or France. Out of those 450,000 people, 40,000 German Africa Corpsmen were brought to Louisiana. The main camps were Livingston in Alexandria, Prochet in New Orleans by the Huey Long Bridge, Ruston and We had sub-camps in Terrebonne Parish. We had 5 camps in Terrebonne Parish. We had 3 camps in the Fouche Parish, and they were subsequently scattered all along the coast. The most POWs we had at one time were in 1946, October of 45. We had 746 people. This book also talks about the 3 Indian tribes, Fala, Wanlashan, and Ila-Jean-Shaw, and the Indian Nut tribes communities. It also talks about the 10 major canals, man-made, that were dug in Terrebonne Parish over the years. The Barataria and the Fouche Canal, to go meet those guys over there. Started in 1830, as I said. We got to them in 1847. The boat works, the story of the train stations, and I told you about that. There are 15 churches that began construction in the 1847, 1850s, 1860s. 7 mission chapels, 5 cemeteries going back to Spanish times, recorded in Spanish documents as far back as 1768, which is Bisland Cemetery. 7 cypress mills, and we are sort of unique in Terrebonne Parish because during the war there was no source of Easter lily bulbs for the United States. The main Easter lily sources were Japan and Bermuda. Terrebonne Parish became the leader in Easter lily production. You look at some of the pictures in the book, fields of Easter lilies. And then, of course, obviously after the war, the Japanese took back over. We had the first offshore oil port in the nation. 1942 was called Port Teche. We sunk 3 oil tankers off the coast, and that was covered or protected by the blimps just to maintain oil production. The 4 original dairies of Terrebonne, the original 7 public schools, the history of Indian education, black education, and Catholic education. The story of the plantation schools and the original plantation stores, which were scattered across the parish and originally owned by the large plantation owners. Terrebonne Parish also was we built or funded, Robert Ruffin Barrow from Residence Plantation funded his brother-in-law Horace Lawson Hundley, and they built the Pioneer, the first submarine in the United States, for the Confederates. It was scuttled when Farragut made his drive to New Orleans. The second submarine was built by the Confederate States, and it was called the American Diver. The third, it sunk a ship in Mobile Harbor, and then they built the CSS Hundley. The Hundley went down February 17, 1864. It sunk the Housatonic in Charleston. So submarine warfare started in Terrebonne Parish. Y'all were still in those battles. We had 4 coastal resorts. We had the first natural gas well drilled in 1899. They knew they had gas in Lower Terrebonne, but they couldn't find it because it kept bubbling through the waterways and the lakes and smelled bad. So they finally developed it. Mr. LeDonois and his partner drilled the first natural gas well. And we have the same type of people, Englishmen, Scotsmen, people that moved from Europe, the East Coast, Mississippi River, and developed these huge plantations. And go to the next one, please. Back. That's what I just talked about. Next. Then you get to the end of the road. Now, you used to be able to drive a buggy for 30 or so more miles to get to Timberlake Island. but you have to get in the boat. Next. And we're going down to Seabreeze. Next. The top is Seabreeze at 1900. It was a waterfront community. They're having a boat race in the middle. They just invented the motor, marine transportation. And the bottom is after the 1909 storm. That's what left, that destroyed the community of Seabreeze on the coast of Terrebonne. Next. That's 1960. And I was there. Next. Coastal erosion down to Brasseaux. The picture on the bottom left was in 2010. It's an island. The big picture is 2015, 5 years later. It's gone. That is at Seabreeze. Famous fella said this: the coast of Louisiana is washing away. The culture and history of French-speaking rural southern Louisiana is running away. And that's one of the things that urged me to do this. Next. First two books, Eyes of an Eagle, and then Louisiana Brands and Bark. Livestock Brands and Bark. Next. Second book out in 2018, The Black and the Buffalo of this series. That is Tobias Gibson's plantation home, the son of the Tobias Gibson Jr., who built first president of Tulane University, built Gibson Hall in Tulane. Next, La Fin. You connais ça? That's the end.
Well, Chris, thank you. You notice that Shane was able to give the entire synopsis of his book in 15 minutes. Chris just spent 45 minutes on the preface of Volume 1. It was very interesting. So who won, Bayou Teche or Bayou Terrebonne? Anyway, we're going to open this up for, we have 8 minutes left.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Where's your friend George Rodrigue from?
St. Martinville.
He was born and raised in New Iberia, but the family, when they first came here, came into Chack Bay.
But it's the Teche that he grew up on.
Yes,
I
ma'am.
just wanted to
One for Shane.
The three Rodrigue brothers came at the same time as my ancestors, and they settled in Chack Bay.
Okay.
And
And
if
then
you go
they
to
learned.
Rufino's here, that's Ruffin Rodrigue, played football at LSU. Same Rodrigue family,
Okay.
but he's from Tudor.
But George learned where to go.
We kept two of the brothers with us.
We need to know that.
Well, before this turns into a battle.
It's coming.
First of all, I want to ask both of you, why is it so important to document the history of these two areas?
I'll tell you, it's a very simple answer. What I found out since I've been doing this over the last 8 or 10 years, we have a generation that's leaving, that are in their 70s and 80s, 90s, and it's the last real link to what occurred in the last 100 years to what we have now. And I'm sure my family is, I have 7 brothers and sisters. I'm the only one in my family that speaks French. They never learned it. The younger generation has no connection. When I say the younger, my children, etc. They have no idea. And that's one of the things that made me do this too, because I have some grandchildren that have 4. Their mother is from Atlanta, Georgia. And she's a Cenac, and it's just, my office is on Cenac Street. We've been there since the 1850s, and it's all gone, and so I started trying to just identify the members in my family. That's how it all started. It's a little tough because you got over here and married a lady, had 12 brothers and sisters, so you had 24 in-laws to start with, and then they had 14 children, and my grandfather was one of 75 grandchildren. So it was, they got a lot of us.
And Shane, tell us why you think it's so important.
So we're just trying to document it before those people leave.
A lot of what he says about that area is true for the Teche also, but the Teche is endangered by litter, pollution, but also overdevelopment. I'm on a group called the New Acadia Project with archaeologist Mark Reese from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, and we're trying to find where the Acadians settled in 1765 when they arrived on the Teche. And a problem is that these settlement sites could, for all we know, be under a road or the foundation of someone's house. We're hoping that's not the case, but more and more people are building businesses and neighborhoods along the Teche, and all of that may be under cement eventually. Another problem is invasive species. Not only the water hyacinth that I mentioned earlier, but nutria and aquatic plants that were originally intended to go in people's aquariums, and people dump that into the bayou, and then it grows like crazy. And certain fish species that moved in and displaced the native fish species. So that's a problem too. So the Teche has changed a lot in the past century. It no longer empties out of its original mouth. It no longer is connected to its original source of fresh water. It's cut in half by a dam and lock. So it's not the river it was in the 19th century. It's changing very rapidly.
So we're seeing things disappear on Teche and Bayou Terrebonne, but for very different reasons.
We have coastal erosion.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. Very different reasons.
Pollution. Port Texaco, we started storing oil, coast of Terrebonne Parish, 1942. And we had 4 large domes initially. The Texas company developed in Terrebonne Parish. Became Texaco, and Texaco, ConocoPhillips, whatever it all is now.
But coastal erosion is the biggest problem in Terrebonne.
Very big, but we have the same pollution problems. We have this Terrebonne is sort of, it's not a navigable. When I say navigable, it's not used for navigation purposes because it's narrower, smaller, shallower. Same thing as the Teche. We have all the same problems, pollution, and the best thing, well, the worst thing about Terrebonne Parish, in contrast to lands to the west, we're the largest parish when we were founded, second largest now. We have about 25% of the entire parish is considered land. 10% was habitable. We have over 2,800 square miles in Terrebonne Parish. That's 10% from the very beginning, and we've been building on that 10% since then, since the 1850s, and we're down to about 4 or 5% of habitable high land.
And before we go, Clifton, do you want to make the case for Bayou Lafourche being the most famous pier, the most famous bayou?
Well, it's just understood that we're the best.
Any other questions? Wendy, I want you to promo what you're going to be talking about, because Wendy's coming up right after this forum.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm going to be talking about the book, The Other Side of the Painting, which is certainly not the scholarly publication that you've been hearing about today by these gentlemen. One of the main reasons for that is, well, it's a very personal account. George and I were together for 23 years, and I was taking notes pretty much the entire time. I worked diligently on this book project for 4 years, and when I started trying to check my facts and make it a bit more scholarly, I asked George questions like, okay, this certain story about this painting or about this slice of history, which unfortunately mostly did revolve around Bayou Teche. Sorry. He would say things like, oh, Wendy, after all this time, can't it just be true? That's about as scholarly as I got, and it's pure nonfiction. Anyway, I would love for you to join me if you would. I'll be sharing some very special paintings here. Those of you that can't join us, just so you know, these are all pieces from our private collection. One of them, the one closest here, which is on the cover of the book, which George chose for the cover of the book, has hung in his studio since he painted it in 1965. It was so important to him. So we're going to talk about all those pieces in just a few minutes and read about the book. Thank you for allowing me to share. And Dr. Cenac, on behalf of George and myself, paying tribute to him with your wonderful publication is very touching and a real honor. And I encourage you all to seek out the book. He included more than a dozen of George's paintings in it. They are reproduced absolutely beautifully. And I was really struck today in everything that I heard from everyone up here about how well they really graphically interpret the region, the mythology, the nostalgia, everything we heard here today. Thank you.
And thank you all for coming out today. Thank you.
I'm always on. You're so
No.
I did it in a year and a half. 15 to 20 miles a day. And it starts off, the canoe goes very fast, and we thought it was because of our rowing, but the water enters the Teche by Tablet, it's flowing through. Then eventually it stops flowing, and then the lower Teche actually reverses. Like I mentioned, doesn't actually out of a canal well, I mean, it's good and bad because it doesn't flood like it used to. Sitting on the top, but it's not like it was in the So, for example, the Teche got really high. Oh yes, that's right, yeah. Good to meet you. You too. And this book. I mentioned him in this book. Okay. That brother's uncle? Yeah, right. Yeah, Royal. I'll get hold of it. I probably ordered you right. Yes, yes, guys. How are you? How's it Right. I even went to a bookstore. They were selling it. I didn't have my copy, so I went to buy a copy. They said, "We'll just do it together."
I'm so glad those are wonderful. Anyone who's interested, I brought pieces from our current exhibitions, just some nice flyers.
Well, Mark Reese, some friends of mine and I, we did the archival research, and we managed to nail it down to an 8-mile area, 4 miles of water.